or a pool of successful individuals, and then you start inferring patterns about their behavior. If you actually look at all the accomplished individuals and you conclude that they all have in common of waking up at 6 a.m. in the morning, then you will be tempted to conclude that waking up at 6 a.m. in the morning or starting work at 6 a.m. is the key to success. But then you will find a billion individuals who wake up earlier than 6 a.m. who don't have that level of success.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to yet another cracking installment of The Matt Brown Show. Today, we're going to be talking about success, formulas to success, laws to success, and we're going to be challenging some preconceived ideas around this whole paradigm of what success really means and the role of society and all this kind of stuff. So, fortunately, I'm not going to be the expert. With me on the line from Boston is Laszlo, Laszlo, I should say, Barabasi. Welcome to the show, bud.
Matt, it's a pleasure to talking to you.
Cool, fantastic. So thank you for being here today. So we're going to be talking about your book, which is called The Formula. I'm showing it up on screen. So The Formula, the Universal Laws of Success. And, if there are universal laws, I would like to know what they are, as I'm sure you do as well. So we're going to get into a whole bunch of amazing content. And so I want to maybe hand the baton to you, Laszlo. Specifically, I'd love you to start by giving us the kind of elevator pitch around who you are and, what do we need to know?
Yes. Well, thank you. And particularly, it's important to talk about who am I, because success is something that has been written so much about. And the question comes, how does an academic like myself come to really write about success? To begin with, I define myself as a network scientist, which means that I devoted the last 20 years of my life, or almost 30 now, to studying different type of complex networks in the world, from genetic networks in our cells to social networks, Facebook, Twitter, internet, you name it. I also often defined as a data scientist. And about 10 years ago, we actually decided that maybe our knowledge of networks could be also beneficial to really understand how the networks in our life drive our individual success. Because we're embedded in different type of professional, personal, family type of networks, we kind of thought, well, maybe knowing these networks could help us understand who succeeds and who doesn't. And I started this journey with my student at that time, Dashun Wang. He's now professor at Northwestern University in the business school. And the question we really asked, like, could we use network science to make progress from a data-driven perspective? And what do I mean by data-driven perspective? Lots of books have been written about success, right? And they're fascinating, some of them. And I have read many of them, particularly part of this project, but they all have a common flaw. And the common flaw is typically that a typical book on success is that you pick one successful individual or a pool of successful individuals or geniuses, you name it. And then you start inferring patterns about their behavior that would indicate what is the secret of their success. And there's only one problem with this, which is, if you actually look at all the accomplished individuals and you conclude that they all have in common of waking up at 6 a.m. in the morning, and then you would be tempted to conclude that waking up at 6 a.m. in the morning or starting work at 6 a.m. is the key to success. But then you will find a billion individuals who wake up earlier than 6 a.m. who don't have that level of success. And what I mean like that's when you want to understand success, it's a little bit like testing a drug. It's not enough to look at successful individuals. You need to look at everybody else who was in the same area competing with them. And this is what we did in the last 10 years. We ended up collecting massive amounts of data about individuals in different creative domains. We have the publication record of all scientists from 1900 till today, our last 120 years. We collected the trajectory of 500,000 artists exhibiting in the last 40 years and so on. we looked at sports, we looked at wines, we looked at lots of different things. But the common feature of our work is that it's data-driven, and we use data to really understand what are the laws, the quantitative laws and patterns that distinguish successful individuals from those who were competing with them in the same domain, but they have not achieved the same level of success.
That's really fascinating for me because, you know, it's so interesting having you on the show specifically, Laszlo, because success is something that I've, you know, been curious about, you know, with regards to this podcast for some time. So I've had billionaires on 6 continents. I've had high performance athletes. I've had, you know, New York Times bestselling authors. I've had, you know, sports, highly successful sportsmen and women, blah, 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 blah. Trying to figure out what are universally true applications for success, because if you can you know, identify what these things are and then share them with the world, you can really make a positive difference. So I have a question I'd love to ask you. What does success mean to you now looking back?
Well, this was actually a major quantitative question for us, is that how do you define success? And the reason this actually is very important is because we are learning in school, you know, that it is performance that really drives success, right? You're taught to exercise, to study, to do many different things, drills and so on, so that you actually enhance performance and success. You have high performance, it implies that you are also successful. You have impact, implies you are successful. And that is not the case. So we had to come up with an operational way of how do we think about performance and success? Are they the same or are they different? And the way we conceptualize that is that we make a major distinction between them. Performance is something that you do, like what kind of shows you put together. In the case of the sports, how fast you run, you know, how many goals you kick. As a scientist, what kind of publications you put, what do you discover? As an artist, how is your painting? What do you paint and so on? So the performance measures are measures that are purely attributed to you. That is something that you do alone. However, success is about what the community sees, notices, and kind of acknowledges of your performance and eventually rewards you for that. That is, in other terms, success is a collective measure. Performance is about you, but your success is about us.
Sure. That's quite a bombshell for me, because my whole preconceived paradigm about success is that, you know, success is really about me. You know what I'm saying? It's the other way around. And that performance, the performance is really quite variable in the sense of, you know, I might wake up today and just kick ass completely, you know, and then I'll interview another scientist or network scientist or, you know, somebody super, another great talent from around the world, and I might underperform according to my own standards. What you're proposing to me is actually quite disruptive in terms of what I understand success to be about, because personally for me, I don't care about what other people think. Do you know what I'm saying? As much as say other people do, and I recognize that I might be unique, but if you're saying that success is about the recognition of your performances and then rewarding, you know, me for that, as an example, as a podcaster, let's take Joe Rogan, for instance, you know, the whole world has kind of rewarded him with their attention as an example. But really, it's quite a significant difference in what success is all about. And I'd love to maybe get some of the data that you've discovered in this space. Obviously, you've studied wine and you've studied sports and these kind of things, business and so forth. What is universally true? Like, if you talk about success being recognition from a community based on the performances that you've given, you know, what does the data tell us about success in that space?
So let's go back a little bit with what you said, because I think it's important to pack it out, right? So I do want to kind of distinguish very clearly differences between what I would call inner success and then the type of success measures that we normally use in our colloquial language. This is to say that there is huge amount of value of personal and inner success. I am very proud and I consider myself successful that I did not forget to show up for this interview, right? And that may be an accomplishment. In this case, it was because I was actually walking to the coffee house when the signal came up, hey, in 10 minutes you have an interview. And I said, oops. And I turned around and came home to do this. Right.
Thank you.
So in a way, there are lots of things that we are and should be proud, right, of what our children accomplish, what like the good that we do day by day towards others, and just growth, right? Just simply kind of being able to learn something, becoming a better person. And those are absolutely valid measures of individual success or personal success, I should say. The problem is that they're not detectable by the outside world, right? They're not measurable. I don't know how you feel. I don't know what are your milestones that you achieve in order to kind of feel good about getting up in the morning, right? So on one end, unfortunately, I would love to be able to study these milestones of personal success, but we're unable to get the data on that. Data does not go inside our head yet, right? But at the same time, when we colloquially talk about somebody else's success, we never talk about how did he feel in the morning when he get up, or whether he or she's proud of their kids of graduating from college or everything else, right? But we say, did he win the game? Is his work in the museum, right? So our colloquial language that we use to denote successful individuals is always about external feedback, about collective community feedback of what we think that the person has accomplished. Lots of books have been written really about, mostly in the psychology area, of how you kind of enhance your inner growth and your personal sense of success. If that's what you are looking for, the formula is not that book, right? The formula acknowledges the fact that we cannot penetrate your inner thoughts, but there is this other measure of external success, which, however, because it's about the community and it's not about you, it becomes measurable. It becomes a big data problem. And once it becomes a big data problem, I'm the expert on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for clarifying that. That makes more sense to me. And I totally agree with you. Like, internal success is very different to external success. So like, internal success for me is being spiritually connected to something or to a cause greater than myself. Or it might be, being an attentive father, or, these sorts of internal things. Or it might just be, about me being happy with the effort that I've made in any given day, as an example. And to your point, that stuff is not measurable. It's not like you can Google Matt's happiness radar. Do you know what I mean? It would be fun, right? But it's not measurable. But when you're looking at the external side of things, as you say, it is measurable. And what's interesting for me, though, is what is the role of perception in all of this? Because if you think about, if people, may follow me on LinkedIn or whatever, or they may see my podcast and they go, hey, Matt, or my YouTube channel, they go, Matt's a successful entrepreneur, right? But it's a perception. It may not be real. In the sense of, what could be reality. Like, I've had people on the show who've told me openly, like, they were on the front covers of 6 magazines in the same month and they were broke. So if you read just the magazines, it's like, okay, Vusi Timbukwe is a very wealthy, successful man. But the reality or the perception may actually be incorrect. So what have you learned about the role of perception in measuring this whole, what is success argument?
Well, I mean, to some degree, it is all about the perception, right? Because if you define the success as a collective measure, that's something that the community gives you, right? Then it's really the community's perception of your performance, right? And so one of the big questions that I'm asking in the book, and we ask in our research day to day, is that how does that performance piece that is undoubtedly there, right? How does and when does it translate into the perception of success? That is there a connection between the performance and success? So, for example, the book is organized around 5 laws, and the first law makes a very odd statement. Performance drives success. That's all good, right? That's what we learned in school. But when performance is immeasurable, networks determine success. And this is one of the fundamental laws, and I'm happy to pack it out with you to say, what does this really mean and how could you apply it to yourself?
Yeah, we're going to have to do that now. So so these 5 laws, let's take the first one. So as you said, so performance drives success. That makes sense, right? If Usain Bolt, I run 100 meters, 9 seconds, great. But when performance can't be measured in terms of time, network drives success. It's quite an interesting idea. Laszlo, do you subscribe to the idea of your network is your net worth?
Listen, I'm a network scientist, so if I would discount the value of the network, I would not be doing my own job, right? And I would not be doing what I believe in. So yes, to some degree, but it's never that simple, right? So I think this book is really about the fact that networks have their place when they are effective. And that's exactly what the first law says, right? That when performance is not measurable, that's when the network steps in. So when is the network not important? Because how many people we know around us who we perceive that they have performance and they get no recognition whatever for what they do. And then when those who get recognition, we often say, really? Why him or why she, right? So when is that piece? When does really the relationship exist between performance and success? And we were able to see that in action. And in order to see it in action, we turn to an area where performance can be very accurately measured, which is sports, right? Because sports is one of the few areas where we have universally agreed on measures of performance. We have a chronometer to measure how fast you run. We have ways of deciding whether you're winning or losing the game. And effectively, we record those performance in real time. And we have extensive records for that going back in many, many years. So we picked an area of sports like tennis. And then we said, to what degree performance and success are connected? Now, what is performance in tennis? Because interesting, because when we talk about a tennis player like Novak Djokovic, right? Let's talk about his performance on the field. And then we say, okay, he has won a certain number of tournaments, mostly won, rarely lost, right? He has made a certain amount of money from awards as well as from endorsements. He has a certain Wikipedia following, quite a number, millions of people Google him on a daily basis and so on. So which here is performance and which is success? Turns out we can very clearly distinguish, right? Winning or losing is performance. Award money is purely connected to his performance, right? Ranking is purely connected to performance. But endorsement money, Wikipedia searches, Google searches are typically collective measures. It's not him who does it, but we do it to him. So we asked, could we actually predict an easily measurable success measure from his performance? And we built a very complicated formula that uses as input only his performance. So that whether he won or lost, what kind of game it was, who he played against, and so on one side. And from that, we wanted to predict how many people will go that week to visit his Wikipedia page, right? And it turned out that we were extremely accurate to do so, right?
Really?
That we could accurately say that in this week, there will be a shut up actually on visitations. Next week, no one will care, depending on whether he played or lost, or how strong was the tournament that he played with. So we confirm precisely using mathematical terms that when it comes to Novak Djokovic, his performance and his performance alone drives his success measure, that is the visibility in the community. Why is that? Well, partly because when it comes to sports, performance can be very, very accurately measured. But that is not true for most areas of performance, right? So if you're a scientist, if you're a broadcast, you're a doctor, you're a teacher, what are your measurable, what is your measurable performance? How do we quantify a performance? And outside of sports, none of us have a real pure performance measure. But when there is performance, that is when the performance is clearly measurable, it uniquely determines success. So that's one piece of the law, right? Now, let's talk about the other piece, the totally opposite one. What happens when you are inherently unable to measure performance, and yet there is success. And you would say, what area would ever have that? Well, turns out that there is one area, which is one of my favorites, and I'm active in that space, which is arts. And when I mean arts, is this actually an artwork, or is this just what it looks like? It's a utilitarian piece of it, and the answer, it depends on where you see it. In my hand with a pencil next to it, it is nothing but what it seems. But if you see it in a museum under a glass box, right, with some major artist names under it, it suddenly transforms itself into art. And the reason I'm using this example is because art, particularly contemporary art, is one of those places where not just looking at the work itself, you are unable to tell whether that is a valuable artwork or it's a piece of junk, right? Whether you have to pay to buy it or you have to pay someone to take it away from you, right? And the truth is that, of course, that valuation there, if you understand the artwork and you know art history and you know who's the artist and so on, but really the value, the transformation of this piece into art, it depends on whose name is on the pedestal, where do you see it, what other artworks that person has done, where was his or her work exhibited before, how much did other collectors pay for his or her work in the past. So fundamentally, the value of a piece of art is inherently determined by the network in which it's embedded, the institutional network that supports the artist is willing to exhibit his or her work, as well as the collector network and the market-based valuation network. And we're able to predict value in the future from these networks alone.
Sure, that's really fascinating. If I could maybe stick with art for now, so because there's quite a buzzy term at the moment is NFTs, right? So non-fungible tokens, and networks driving the value of essentially JPEGs or art, digital art that's made off a basis of whatever it might be. So Gary Vaynerchuk, as an example, designed caricatures, right, which were terrible, and yet people paid several $1 million. I think he made $80 million off that stuff. It was quite ridiculous. But this is what I'm using that as a reference that I have in my mind about what you're describing, in the sense of, is that caricature actually worth anything? And with the networks bolted onto that, that is what's actually driving the value of those physical art pieces, right?
Yes, and I'm glad you mentioned NFTs because it's an area that I'm very active in, both as an artist. I have sold my NFTs actually, as well as a researcher. So, and I love the NFT-based art, and I can tell you why I love it. Because the artwork is traditionally very opaque, meaning that there is very little data, with the exception of a few data sets that we own actually in our lab. But it's very secretive in the sense that you don't really know how much an artwork sells on the primary market, meaning how much does the artist get when it first sells it. You don't even know the secondary market unless it goes on a public auction. There's lots of secrets in that place. The NFT art space, however, has many, many characteristics of the traditional art space, but every single transaction is open. That is, every single transaction is visible. So for that reason, when NFTs emerged last year, exactly a year ago, we ended up starting to map out the NFT art space. And I had a major New York Times piece that I wrote exactly a year ago about NFT art market, showing that the way the NFT art market behaves is really mimicking the traditional art space, the way value creation happening, the role of the investors, the role of the collectors in that space, and the way the collectors behave. And so in that sense, the study that I described in the formula, where we studied the classical art market, is now being repeated again in the digital art space.
So it's interesting. So you're saying that history is almost repeating itself in this NFT land.
Oh yes, of course. I mean, think about it. So why do we have the art gallery system today that we do? And that is because when Impressionism came along, the French Academy has shut them down. So they had no access to traditional galleries. Institutions where they could present their work. And as a result, dealers have emerged, which today we call them gallerists, and we often still call them dealers, right? And the modern gallery system has emerged in the back of the Impressionists. That is, a few individuals who saw that there is value in this art, and they started to buy them en masse. One particular collector has bought as many as 6,000 Impressionist canvases directly from the artists themselves. And then that person created the market that we see today. Now, fast forward 150 years, right? And what happened with crypto art is that a big group of artists creating digital art had no access to the gallery or the museum system, in the same way that Impressionists had no access to the academic back then. And what did they do? Well, they took advantage of the crypto world and created their own gallery system, which is called Super Rare, which is called Foundation, which is called Nifty Game, which is called Art Blocks, and so on. And they created their own market that runs parallel with the traditional art markets. But the mechanisms that are in play, the collector habits, the way artists become famous there, it's following exactly the same plan before. And hence there is no mistake about that giant sale by Beeple, right, happened where? Not in the NFT space, but at Sotheby's, which is the holder of the traditional art world, right? And now there is a total connection between the traditional art space and the NFT space in the sense that galleries show NFTs. Our NFTs are now exhibited at one of the top European museums, actually in two places, one in Berlin and one in Karlsruhe at ZKM, right? And will be exhibited next month here in Boston. And so there is a symbiosis that is happening now between the traditional art world and the NFT space, because what they do is exactly the same.
That's really fascinating, because the thing is, for me, I'm curious now, like, do you feel that we're going to, I mean, obviously you're the preeminent world leader at discovering the role of like network value creation, if you like. But if you're sitting on data, like obviously there's technology like AI and machine learning and things like this. Do you see in the future, Laszlo, that we will reach a point where we can predict whether X will be worth Y values? I mean, if you stick with art for now as an example, take NFTs. Let's stick with NFTs for a moment. The gorilla design. So is there a way, do you see in the future, maybe not now, but in the future, based on what you see currently, that you could predict what the value of like gorilla NFT art would be?
And the answer is yes. And we have done that, not in the NFT space, but in the classical art space. And so let's go back a little bit of how did we kind of study the role of the network in the art space. And it was kind of driven intellectually by a beautiful case study, right? Is that in the 1970s, a graffiti artist has actually emerged. His name was Samo in New York City. And it started to fill up all the works with different images, and then had actually always signed Samo. And what's interesting historically, that we know that it was not artists, but two artists actually behind that. One of them, his name is Albert-Laszlo, who's an artist, is still alive and working in New York City, and I actually own work by him. And the other artist, and these were all kind of in the very early 20s, is not with us any longer, and his name was Basquiat. What is interesting is that these were both actually high school students when they started working together. They did exactly the same type of visual type of work. And yet one became the superstar artist who still holds the record of the largest amount of money paid for a living for an American artist, which is Basquiat. And the other one, who did exactly the same type of work, they were indistinguishable early on, is still struggling to make it as an artist in New York City. So where is this difference comes from? And to really understand that difference, we ended up collecting data, getting data from an app called Magnus, where we had the history of 500,000 artists and all their exhibitions. So with that, we were able to reconstruct the history of every single artist, where he or she exhibited around the world. And the question we ask is really, how does really value emerge in the art space? And value emerges in art space through institutions, right? Of what gallery is willing to exhibit you, what museums are willing to exhibit you. So we built a giant network, really beautiful, actually, the way when you look at the image, if you have a chance to look for it on the web, a really beautiful network of showing how the institutions are connected if they exhibited the same artist. Why would you connect the MoMA and the Guggenheim if they exhibit the same artist? Because it tells us that they have a similar definition of what contemporary art is. Because if they're willing to engage with the same artist, it means that they both consider that artist of interest and value. And so when we built this big network of about 20,000 institutions worldwide, we were in for some really interesting surprises. Turns out that MoMA, Pompidou, Tate, Guggenheim, Gagosian, the big places, both galleries and museums, were all in one tightly connected art cluster, that meaning that they all kind of exhibited the same artist over and over. So they were very deeply connected. But this was a small cluster compared to the whole universe of institutions. And what we saw that there were lots of other semi-isolated clusters from this big value one, like the one that actually includes South Africa and many African institutions, and the one that includes Australia and many ocean galleries and so on, and the separate European, Eastern European ones that were totally isolated from this central cluster, which meant that from an artist perspective who is in South Africa, he or she is in a cluster that gives him or her the chance to exhibit throughout his life successfully in many, many institutions and have a life as an artist, but has no paths to the major institutions where the big value is created, like MoMA, Guggenheim, and so on. So the artwork was really fragmented into these different islands, and you could be a New York-based gallery and not to be on that big value cluster, right? But really representing art that is peripheral from that central value system of the art. Why was this network interesting for us? Beyond that, it was really beautiful. And if you have a chance, edit in the image if you want of that into the show. The real value came from the fact that once you gave me an artist's first 5 exhibits and we put it on this map, we could use machine learning to predict where he or she will be exhibiting next and whether his or her career will raise, giving access to better and better valued institutions, that higher prestige institutions, or will stay where it is, and so on. And there were some heartbreaking conclusions from that study, right? One of them is that really the first 5 exhibits is very determining of where your future career goes. We were extremely accurate predicting the future career 20 years into the future. And what was interesting is that those artists who come up from prestigious school like Yale Art School or Art Institute of Chicago, they typically start their career high, meaning that they're right away taken over by some high-level institutions, start exhibiting them, and they will always stay for the rest of the career there. There are very few people who really start at the periphery and make it to the top. The top is already busy with these youngsters who start when they were young, start high, and they stay there and they occupy all the prestigious institutions with their exhibitions. But a few did, and we're very interested. How do you go from the bottom to the top? How do you go from a no-name South African institution to really be exhibited at MoMA? And it was possible. And we find about 270 artists who have done that. And what we found that these artists have done, they pursued their career very differently from the other artists. The traditional model is you are an artist graduating from art school, and then a local gallery typically takes you up and starts representing and giving you exhibition opportunities and so on, but you're staying within the intersphere of that gallery. What we found that those who actually managed to break out of this pattern are those who, instead of localizing themselves early on, they were exhibiting crazily across institutions of many different levels, across different countries nearby. And accidentally, they hit across 1 or 2 institutions who had a path towards that central high value cluster, and they were sucked into the more valuable institutions through them. So this early desperate search, rather than settling in early with a couple of supporting institutions, was what distinguished these artists who went from the bottom to the top. But back to your original question, using this network, we are able to predict whether an artist will succeed or not, which comes back to the statement that we have in the first law, right? Is to say that when performance is not measurable, the predictive value about your success is entirely in your network. Tell me where you are in the network, and I'll tell you where I'm going to go next.
That's crazy. It's nice to think that it can be reduced to something as simple as that, right? So like where you are in your network is ultimately, the greatest predictor of kind of future sort of success, if you like. But I'd love to maybe cover a couple of the other laws for a moment. So the second law that you've written about in your book is basically called performance is bounded, but success is unbounded. Could you spend just a couple minutes unpacking that for our audience around the world?
Oh, absolutely. And this comes back to some of the early discussion we had about, how can we measure performance? And there are places where we can measure performance, like sports and other places. But let's talk on sports. And the best example is Usain Bolt, right? And Usain Bolt is clearly the fastest man on earth, right? He won competition after competition. But when you actually look at his performance, how fast he runs, it turns out that he wins those competitions with often less than 1% difference in the speed of running from the one who loses it, right? And he may be the fastest man on earth, but he's not running 10 times faster than I do. And I'm not a runner at all, right? So what this shows is that, yes, there's no question. We know that he's the fastest man on earth, yet his performance is virtually indistinguishable from the top other runners on the world, and it's not so much higher than the average runners. And only with chronometers we're able to see the difference. And even with chronometers, we cannot, right? So if you think about the Rio Olympics, there was a very interesting case that kind of was personal for me because I'm splitting my time between Budapest and Boston, that is US and Hungary. And it turned out that three swimmers, one Phelps with the American champion and the Hungarian champion Che, and a third swimmer, they ended up at all of them winning the competition. They were indistinguishable. So they actually all had to share the bronze rather than anyone then getting gold. So the question is, how is it possible? Did they know who swam faster? Well, they certainly knew who arrived fast. There were video recordings showing who touched first the end of the piscine, right? But the reason they had to share all of them, the third prize, is because the difference in time in swimming between them was less than 2.5 centimeters, which is how much was the certification of the swimming pool. That is, we could not measure more accurate than 2.5 centimeter accuracy the swimming pool itself, or that's what the Olympic rules define. And as a result, the Olympic Committee could not decide who is the faster swimmer. Now, if you think about it, in the areas of sports where we have cameras, video recording, chronometers, and we cannot decide who is the best, how can we decide when it comes to teachers, professors, doctors, and so on? And this is an inherent problem in performance. Every time we can measure performance, it's not that we cannot distinguish the weak from the strong, the good from the bad. But at the top, among the strongest ones, there are a few of them that are virtually indistinguishable. And this is what I call performance is bounded. No matter how good you are at what you do, you're not going to be 10 times better than the person next to you. You're going to be at most 1% better. And that's a very humbling message, at least for me, right? Because we all tend to think, oh, if I'm going to do better, I'm going to work harder, I'm going to be so much better than my competitor. No, at most, you will be in the same league with your competitor. Because kind of if you are lacking chronometers and videos and you don't have a performance measure that is one-dimensional, like the speed of running, we're really unable to tell the difference. So that's about performance. Success is a different animal. What I mean by different animal is that the best example I like to give in that sense is that when my second book, Bursts, came out in 2009, I was watching with my editor who is the competition, who is on the bestseller list, because you want to be in the bestseller list, right? If you write a book for general audience. And so we thought we had some really formidable competition, because it was the same week that my book came out Dan Brown's book of The Lost Signal, as well as the Lost Song by Nicholas Sparks. And then we said, okay, well, fine, tough competition. Let's see how many copies they sold that week. And turns out Nicholas Sparks, who was #2 on the bestseller list, has sold that week 120,000 copies, which is huge in books, right? In the sense that you can end up on the New York Times bestseller list with about 3,000 copies sold in that week, the #1. And you can typically be in the top with 10,000 copies, 10 to 30,000 copies it takes to be #1, guaranteed. Yet with 120,000 copies, Nicholas Sparks was #2. So then why is that? Could he work a little harder to become #1? Not in this case, because Dan Brown the same weekend sold 1.2 million copies, right? Now, what is the performance difference in terms of quality of writing, interesting of the books and things like that between Dan Brown's and Nicholas Sparks? Many people would swear it would go the other way around, right? I'm not there to judge who is the better writer, right? But what I'm there to tell you is that because success is a collective measure, we all buy Dan Brown's book and Nicholas Sparks' book, right? The difference between #1 and #2 is not any more less than 1%, but can be orders of magnitude difference from 120,000 to 1.2 million. And this is what we call performance is unbounded. That when you are in the top in terms, well, success is unbounded. Let me take it back. Yes, but this is why we say success is unbounded, because when we look at any success measure, whether how many books a writer sells, how many citations a scientist get, how much visibility does a tennis player get, #1 and #2 are orders of magnitude different, right? So it is really this dichotomy that we're trying to understand. Mathematically speaking, those of you who actually love the math side of this, every performance measure follows an exponential distribution, and every success measure, collective measures, follows a power law. And those of you who know the math side of that, those are very different animals. And one of the big challenges for us to ask, how is it possible that less than 1% difference in performance leads to orders of magnitude difference in success? And that's the big dilemma of really to understand success. And that is really the real topic of the formula.
That's fascinating here. I think the key thing I'm going to take away from that is that, 3,000 copies in a week is New York Times bestseller. So that's a life goal for me. And then 10,000 copies guaranteed, right? I actually thought it was way more than that for some reason.
Well, guaranteed unless you have Dan Brown or Nicholas Sparks coming out.
Yeah, exactly. This is why.
That's when it comes to that, right? Is that then it's totally unpredictable, the maximum. When it comes to success, when it comes to performance, it's totally predictable what the maximum is because we're all alike.
That's amazing. Cool. So let's change gears and get into the fifth law. So we've skipped a few. That's why you need to go and buy Laszlo's book. But the fifth law here is, I'm all about promoting my guests, man. This is the law. And this, by the way, is such a truism. I read about this in my book, funnily enough. So, but this law is with persistence, success can come at any time. Love that. It's the greatest predictor in my experience of future success. So I think I'm sold on that law totally. But would love to uncover with you, like, how did you land on that particular one? Because that's a very interesting law from my perspective.
I love that you asked that. And let me give you my personal perspective of that, right? So I'm a scientist, right? And I kind of made my career by publishing kind of in my 30s, very, very high impact papers, very, very highly cited papers. Some of them are the decade's most cited papers. And then you keep asking yourself as your beard is getting grayer and grayer, right? Is that, can I keep up that performance, right? Like, will I be able to publish papers that would even overcome the impact of my earlier papers? And that's what you keep dreaming as a scientist, right? But then you look around in literature and you look at people like Einstein, who should know that, right? And he made the claim that if a scientist has not made his claim of fame by the 1930s, then he or she will never do so. So based on Einstein's claim, it looks like that I'm a dead wood. So the question we ask it to ask both in science terms and then in other areas is that really, what's the relationship between age and accomplishment? Because and this is a very generally held view. When you look at the Silicon Valley, there is belief that you got to be in your 20s, Mark Zuckerberg or somebody else, right, to really start a successful companies, and don't even try in your 50s. And area to area, we celebrate the equation youth equals success and youth equal originality and so on. So we said, is it true? And we started actually looking first at scientists, reconstructing all scientists' career, those who ended their career. And we asked, when does a scientist publish his or her best work? Is it true that it's early in the career or it's kind of later in the career? And the answer was very surprising. What we found is that seems to be an early career effect that most scientists publish their most impactful work relatively early, that is the first 10 to 15 years in their career. But that doesn't mean that there are more creative early in the career than later. Rather, the only reason that happens at that time is because they're more productive early in the career than later in the career. That is, what we discovered is that when you take all the project a scientist or an artist or any creative person done and you put them from 1 to n after each other, in that 1 to n space is totally random which one going to be the highest impact work in that artist or scientist career. However, it turns out that work is not uniformly distributed in somebody's life, but when we are young, we do a lot. We publish lots of papers, we paint lots of canvases, we publish lots of books and so on. And as time goes on, we slow down. And because of that slowdown, it appears that young people are creative. No, young people are busy, and otherwise it's totally random when creativity comes. And for the people, for creative individuals who are willing to stay with their trade, success can come very, very late in their career. And my favorite example is John Flynn. John Flynn is a chemist who got the Nobel Prize for Chemistry for a work that he published after he was forcefully retired by Yale University. When he reached 65, they told him, okay, retirement age, at that time was still legal in the US, and they closed his lab down. And they said, you can sit around and teach a little bit, but we're not going to fund any more research by you, not going to support. So then he left Yale University and went to Virginia Commonwealth University, opened another lab. And it was there where he made his groundbreaking research that led to the Nobel Prize. And following our work where we showed that really there is no such a thing as age when it comes to creativity, other people actually have shown that this is true actually in business world as well. So they started to analyze what is the age distribution of the funders of the successful firms in Silicon Valley. And again, Silicon Valley has a huge youth bias, right? If you look at who are the CEOs of the year, it's always in the late 20s and early 30s. You never find actually older individuals. Yet, when you actually look at the data of what was the age of the funder and whether the company had a successful exit or not, whether it went to the stock market or was purchased at the proper price, it turns out that the older the funder, the more likely that the company will have an exit. And actually, if you are in your 50s as a funder, right, you have about 2 times more likely to have a successful company than if you're starting a company in your 30s. Which is music to my ear. I started actually several companies in my 50s. One of them has just kind of brought in another $110 million for investment, and we're really edging nicely towards a successful exit. And I'm hoping that the data is showing that whatever I start in my 50s will be all successful companies. So bring it on.
Dude, congratulations. Amazing. That's incredible. And you know what? It's so true, actually, you know, because I've founded over the last 20 years, I've founded, 14 odd startups. But this exit now, I'm 40, I've, had multiple exits, but this particular exit is the biggest one that I've had because of my age. And I actually do subscribe to you. I have a friend of mine in my network. He runs a very successful creative agency called Retroviral. His name's Mike Sharman. And he and I were chatting one day, and he actually said to me, most entrepreneurs, they get their biggest success when they're in their 50s. And I didn't understand why, but now I'm hearing you speak, it now makes perfect sense to me. based on like the way that you describe it. So takeout, guys, from what I'm hearing is definitely have a co-founder that's older than you.
And if you think about it, Google founded by kids in their 20s, but they had a CEO in the 50s, right? When they actually went to market with it. Yeah. So you gotta have in your team. And of course, we haven't talked about the fourth law, which is all about the teamwork, right? And how does a team become successful? And there we also see how much this diversity matters. And there's over and over lots of evidence to show that the secret of success is not a magical age, but rather your willingness to stay with your trade and try over and over and over, because success can truly come at any time.
That's amazing. And I want to end on that because that is such a powerful bombshell. Thank you, Laszlo, for your time. I have one more question for you. Why do you do this? Like, what gets you out of bed in the morning?
That's a very, very good question. And I do it because I'm a curious person, right? And I don't only do science. Our work is exhibited. The one that you see behind me are right now, all of those works are in major museums. So I am always looking for different ways in which I can understand the world around me, driven by curiosity. And for that, I have multiple vehicles or way to do that. One of them is my research lab with 30 researchers here in Boston, right? The other one is my trajectory as an artist, which allows me to express in a visual way many of the discoveries that we do. I'm not going to start actually painting still life, right? Our art is connected deeply to the science journey that we have, right? And we do visualizations and art that is coming from the science. And finally, I write about these things, like I did the formula, right, that you were talking about today, is because this is the way I can reach a bigger audience, a wider audience. What I mean, because I really wrote the formula because I saw that we had one research paper after the other one that was really so impactful to people's life. But the research paper is not the way to reach people like you and your audience, right? So I also write as a third way of expressing myself to bring the ideas that we discover in my lab to a general audience. But it's all rooted in the journey of discovery that I've been part of in the last 30 years as a scientist.
Sure, that's crazy, man. Look, listen, I'm super inspired, especially on that last point that we covered about perseverance, because it's so easy to quit something when things get hard, and there's 1,000 reasons not to do something. You just need to find one reason to keep going. And your reason about perseverance is most definitely something that I will hold close to my heart as I continue to be successful, quote unquote, as an entrepreneur and podcaster. So thank you, Laszlo, for your time. It's been a real privilege having you on the show.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks everybody for being here today. Thanks for everybody on YouTube. We will see you all again soon. Ciao.
And thanks for doing this. This was fun.